Hey, 42 here. On the 7th of October 1849, a heavily intoxicated man was found lying in the gutter outside a pub in Baltimore. As is traditional with intoxicated men in gutters, this one cut a fairly unimpressive figure, and he was muttering to himself incoherently. In other words, he could have been any drunk in any gutter almost anywhere in the world. But this man wasn't just anyone. He was Edgar Allan Poe, one of the greatest writers who's ever lived. And exactly how he ended up in that gutter in 1849 remains one of the biggest mysteries in the history of literature. Now, I know what you're thinking. Isn't it pretty bloody obvious how an extremely drunk man ended up in a gutter outside a pub? But bear with me, because this plot is about to thicken. Poe was taken to the nearby Washington Medical Center for treatment, and it was there that something odd happened. Or should I say, didn't happen. Considering the state he was in, everyone assumed Poe was raging drunk. But even the drunkest of men will sober up sooner or later, whereas Poe remained in this same delirious, incoherent state for 4 days straight. And then he died. By all accounts, it was a strange way to go, especially since he was only 40 at the time. But things were about to get stranger still, because it turned out that Poe had been missing for almost a week before he was found in that gutter. And to this day, we have no idea where he went or what he did in the meantime. He just seems to have disappeared off the face of the earth, only to turn up half mad and die a few days later. It's hard to miss the irony that Poe's mysterious death reads like something straight out of one of his own stories. And there are some genuinely wild theories about exactly what happened to him. Winter is the perfect time to get stuck into a mobile game at home, and I've discovered this amazing game that's available on mobile and PC, and you can seamlessly switch between devices. There are over 800 champions ranging from lizard-like creatures to elves and orcs. If you're into collecting awesome characters with beautiful gameplay, click the link in the description or scan the QR code on screen. And now, Raid Shadow Legends and Monster Hunter are colliding in an amazing limited time crossover. Starting on January the 9th and finishing on March the 5th, players will be able to collect 5 Monster Hunter themed legendary champions. Everyone will be able to get Rathalos Blademaster legendary champion for free, simply by logging into Raid for 7 days between now and February the 27th. Players can get the other 4 Monster Hunter themed champions via special in-game events, so check in-game to see how you can collect these amazing champions. The Cursed City is one of Raid's biggest features since the Doom Tower, with 100 stages to complete, including stages where you'll need to take down 2 of Raid's bosses at the same time. Click my link in the description or scan my QR code on screen to get insane bonuses available only via my link. You'll get 2 epic champions with my link. The first is Lightsworn, a very strong epic champion from the Sacred Order, and Juliana after reaching level 15. Additionally, once you're in-game, use the promo code RAIDXmas for new and old players. Come find me under the name 42 and you can join my clan and we'll be legends together. So just hit my link in the description and I'll see you on the battlefield. And thanks to Raid Shadow Legends for sponsoring this video. But before we get onto Poe's death, we should probably talk about his life. Because what a life it was. Most people think of Edgar Allan Poe predominantly as a horror writer, but the truth is, he was so much more than that. He single-handedly invented detective fiction, was one of the founders of sci-fi alongside authors like Mary Shelley and Jules Verne, and he was one of the first people to explore the art of the short story. It's also been largely forgotten that before he took to storytelling, Poe had an extremely promising career in the military, and he might have gone right to the top if he hadn't have got himself court-martialed on purpose. He was also something of a polymath, and despite never having any formal scientific training, he used the power of his frankly frightening imagination to somehow predict the origin of the universe and the existence of black holes several decades before the actual scientists came up with them. And then there's what is probably my favourite story about Edgar Allan Poe, one that, fittingly enough, comes from beyond the grave. I don't want to spoil it, but let's just say it involves an accidental prediction so utterly spectacular, some people genuinely believe Poe might have just been a time traveller. Stick around till the end of this video and I'll fill you up on those details, and trust me, it will be worth it. But for now, without further ado, this is the remarkable, incredible, near-unbelievable life story of Edgar Allan Poe. Edgar Poe was born on the 19th of January 1849 in Boston, Massachusetts. Early life for little Edgar was, well, it wasn't great. His father left the family home and never came back when Edgar was just a year old. And the year after that, his mother Eliza died of what is today assumed to have been tuberculosis. Just in case that wasn't a bad enough start to life for Edgar and his two siblings, they were then split up and sent to live with 3 different families. Presumably thoroughly traumatized by this point, Edgar ended up in Richmond, Virginia with Scottish merchant John Allan and his wife, Frances. He was never formally adopted, but the Allans did have Edgar baptized, and that's where he acquired the missing third of that catchy name of his. The Allans were one of the wealthiest families in all of Richmond, and Edgar was given an education befitting his new station, including a 5-year stint in the UK where he studied at some of the finest boarding schools around. In 1826, he attended the University of Virginia, founded 7 years earlier by some bloke called Thomas Jefferson, where he studied ancient and modern languages. Poe had always been an excellent student, but like many young men attending university for the first time, rather than concentrate on his studies, he decided to go absolutely bloody mental instead. Within a year, he was forced to drop out after amassing substantial drinking and gambling debts. That was pretty bad, but things were about to get even worse, because like many filthy rich men, John Allan absolutely detested the idea of wasting money. In order to make sure his foster son couldn't fritter away any more of it losing at cards, Allan simply turned off the money tap. Which is why, at the age of 18, a flat broke Edgar Allan Poe decided to join the army. Taking the stereotype of writers being frail, bookish types and bayoneting it into a billion bloody bits, Poe took to the army like a duck to hoisin sauce. He made short work of the lower rungs of the military ladder and was eventually selected from amongst 500 of his peers for promotion to Sergeant Major, the highest rank possible for a non-commissioned officer. In 1829, he left the army to enroll as a cadet at the United States Military Academy, better known as West Point. But he lasted less than a year after realizing his true calling was not with war, but words. Rather than just, quit, he decided to go out with a bit of a bang by deliberately getting himself court-martialed. Exactly how he did it is a subject of some debate, but according to legend, he was dismissed after turning up butt naked to a parade ground drill. Sadly, that story is probably apocryphal. Most historians agree he simply ignored his duties until those in charge were left with no option but to give Poe the heave-ho. With his military career behind him, he made the bold decision to dedicate himself to writing full-time. That might not sound like such a big deal these days, but back then, it was practically unheard of. Poe is widely accepted as being the first American writer to make a living solely from writing. In other words, he quit a promising career in the military to do a job that didn't even exist yet. Perhaps unsurprisingly, it didn't go all that well. It wasn't that he found it difficult to find buyers for his stories. He didn't. The trouble was, they paid like shit. Copyright law was still in its infancy, meaning rather than pay local writers a fair price for their work, American magazines could simply print stories by British authors for free. There was precious little point paying Poe a pretty penny when you could lift literature straight from the limeys. Try saying that 10 times fast. With stories and poems not yet putting food on the table, let alone paying the rent, in 1835 Poe got himself a job as a staff writer and critic at the Southern Literature Messenger in Richmond. The chance to earn a steady, albeit fairly pitiful, wage was a major breakthrough in Poe's career. Or at least it would have been if he hadn't got himself fired inside the first month for being drunk on the job. Not that he let unemployment get him down, he put his newfound spare time to good use by finding love. And when I say love, I mean he married his cousin. His 13-year-old cousin. Yeah. The happy cousins, couple, were wed by a minister named Amasa Converse. That random fact has no bearing whatsoever on this story, but I had to include it because history should never have forgotten that neckbeard. A month after getting the boot from the messenger, Poe was rehired, and this time things went much more smoothly. Not only was he able to get many of his own stories and poems published, he also started to make a name for himself as a literary critic, an absolutely savage literary critic. Over the next few years, he bounced around several different publications, writing stories and poems and just generally eviscerating the work of his colleagues for fun. In 1841, he casually invented an entirely new genre of fiction when he published a short story called The Murders in the Rue Morgue. It was both the first modern detective story and the first locked room mystery, and it featured a character called C. Auguste Dupin, an eccentric but brilliant amateur detective who used his almost supernatural analytical abilities to solve crimes. If that sounds a tad familiar, it's probably because a certain, rather famous fictional detective was very clearly inspired by Poe's creation. Without Dupin, there would have been no Sherlock Holmes. By the way, it's thought that Poe came up with the idea for Dupin whilst doing a bit of detective work himself in figuring out the trick behind the chess-playing automaton known as the Mechanical Turk. I covered the Turk back in 2020, and it's one of my favourite videos on the channel. I highly recommend you check it out if you haven't already. In 1843, Poe entered a story called The Gold Bug into a national competition. It won the grand prize, pocketing him a cool $100, probably more than he was ever paid for a single piece of work. But its impact was far more than just financial. In fact, you could say the Gold Bug was indirectly responsible for saving tens, perhaps hundreds of thousands of lives. A key element of the story's plot involved a real cryptogram that, once solved, revealed the location of some good old-fashioned buried treasure. Cryptography wasn't well known in those days, and in the decades after its publication, The Gold Bug would introduce tens of thousands of young readers to the concept for the very first time. Amongst them were Leo Marx and William Friedman, both of whom read Poe's stories as children and found the idea of cryptography so fascinating that in later life they went on to work in the field. Leo Marx became chief cryptographer for the Special Operations Executive, a secret organization credited by General Eisenhower with shortening the Second World War by at least 3 months. And William Friedman, along with his wife Elizabeth, went on to become one of the most influential codebreakers in history. As the chief cryptanalyst at the Signal Intelligence Service during the Second World War, his teams broke multiple Japanese ciphers, saving countless lives in the process. In 1845, Poe's now legendary poem, The Raven, was published in the New York Evening Mirror, and it was an instant hit. It's often reported that Poe died penniless and in obscurity. But only half of that is actually true. Like most of his work, he didn't make much money from The Raven, selling it for just $9. But it immediately struck a chord with readers all over America and beyond, transforming Poe into a household name almost overnight. To this day, The Raven remains one of the most famous and best-loved poems of all time, as well as one of the most quoted and parodied pieces of literature in history. Even now, references to the iconic poem pop up all over the place, from The Simpsons to the NHL, and from League of Legends to Star Trek. 3 years after The Raven, Poe published an essay called Eureka. It was a major departure from his typical style, covering, of all things, his ideas about the makeup of the universe itself. You might think that's a fairly unusual area of interest for a writer with zero scientific training, and plenty of people at the time agreed. In fact, Eureka was so downright odd that some viewed it as compelling evidence Poe was losing his marbles. Little did they know that many decades after Poe's death, Eureka would prove to be one of the most unexpectedly insightful essays ever written. Now that might sound like a pretty big statement, but, well, see for yourself. In the mid-19th century, when Eureka was written, the overwhelming scientific consensus was that the universe was infinite, unchanging, and eternal. But Eureka describes a dynamic, ever-shifting universe born from a single primordial particle that expanded outwards to create all matter. In other words, Edgar Allan Poe predicted the Big Bang almost 80 years before scientists did. Hidden within the complex labyrinth that is Eureka are also allusions to the relationship between energy and matter, the role of the speed of light in the universe, the existence of black holes, and the concept of a cyclical universe that's born and reborn over and over again. It would be decades until any of these ideas appeared in scientific literature. Eureka is so remarkable that even today, scholars aren't really sure what to do with it. Alongside all the brilliant bits, Poe also got plenty wrong, but what he got right is just uncanny. Normal people just shouldn't be able to randomly guess the deepest, darkest secrets of the universe just by having a bit of a think whilst sitting on the toilet. Eureka turned out to be one of Poe's last major works. On the 27th of September 1849, at the age of just 40, he got on a train in Richmond to go to New York, where he was living at the time. For the following week, nobody had any idea whatsoever what happened to him until he turned up in that Baltimore gutter days before his death. One theory is that he may have been subjected to something called cooping, a kind of political fraud in which victims were kidnapped and forced to vote for certain candidates in elections, often multiple times whilst wearing a variety of disguises. That might sound, well, mental, but cooping was actually quite common in Baltimore at the time, and it would at least explain some of the stranger details of the case, like why Poe was in Baltimore in the first place and why he was wearing someone else's clothes. Many victims of cooping were beaten or plied with alcohol or drugs, a combination of which might also explain Poe's apparent delirium when he was found, and were perhaps even the cause of his death. Cooping is certainly one of the most popular theories about Poe's death and disappearance, but it isn't the only one. Poe was buried in an unmarked grave in a Baltimore graveyard. But as the years went by and his popularity as a writer continued to grow, it was decided that he needed a more fitting resting place. In 1875, a fancy monument was erected nearby, and Poe's remains were exhumed so that they could be reburied at the new site. When his body was moved, the local gravedigger claimed he could clearly hear Poe's brain rattling around inside his skull. At the time, nobody thought anything much about it. But these days, we know the gravedigger's story makes no sense. There's simply no way a human brain could have survived 26 years underground without decomposing. But if it wasn't Poe's grey matter bumping around inside his head, what was it? Well, it's possible that little lump may have been the calcified remains of a brain tumour. If that's true, it might explain Poe's odd behaviour and delirium in the days before his demise, and it would also give us a clear cause of death. There have been literally dozens of other theories over the years, including everything from mercury poisoning to rabies or even murder. But the truth is, we'll likely never know for sure what exactly killed Edgar Allan Poe. And perhaps it's fitting that the death of the great mystery writer will itself forever remain a mystery. Oh, and speaking of mysteries, it's time I told you about the greatest coincidence in history. In his all too short life, Poe wrote precisely one novel, the narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym of Nantucket. The book tells a story of a stowaway on board a whaling ship called the Grampus. At some point, the Grampus is badly damaged in a severe storm that only 4 of the crew survive. And over the course of the following few weeks, adrift at sea, they slowly begin to succumb to starvation. The crew manage to bring a few provisions up from the flooded depths of the ship, including a small tortoise, but it isn't enough. And with no land in sight and nothing else to eat, they eventually turn to cannibalism. They draw straws, and the loser is the youngest survivor, a boy called Richard Parker, who is killed and eaten by the others. The novel was published in 1838, and it was largely a flop. But almost 50 years later, something incredibly weird happened. In 1884, a yacht called the Mignonette sank somewhere in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. Just like in Poe's novel, 4 men survived the sinking, and, just like the novel, soon enough, they were starving. As luck would have it, they managed to catch a turtle, but the fresh meat didn't sustain them for very long. Okay, so it isn't quite a tortoise, but it's close enough. Eventually, the survivors grew so desperate they decided one of them should be sacrificed for the good of the others. And, just like in Poe's novel, it was the youngest member of the crew who was chosen, and, ultimately, eaten. Pretty remarkable, right? But I know what you're thinking. It's a pretty weird coincidence, but the biggest in history? There must have been dozens of cases of cannibalism aboard ships in the years since Poe died. It's hardly a miracle that one of them involved the same number of crew, a tortoise/turtle, and the youngest member being sacrificed. But there's one piece of information I haven't told you yet. Something that transforms this from a quirky coincidence into something more than a little bit spooky. I didn't tell you the name of the crew member who was eaten. Just like in Poe's story, his name was Richard Parker. What the actual By the way, if that name is ringing any bells, it might be because the tiger in The Life of Pi is also called Richard Parker. Author Jan Martel chose it as a kind of Easter egg to pay homage to the greatest coincidence in literary history. And if you happen to have read the book or have seen the film, you'll know exactly how fitting that name is. Edgar Allan Poe struggled for most of his life to realise his dream of becoming an author. It's an enormous shame that he never got to find out quite how spectacularly that dream would eventually come true. Today, he is universally regarded as one of the greatest authors who ever lived. And his influence on modern fiction has been so great that without him, many of the stories we know and love would never even have existed. What a tragedy it is that he died so young, to fill our world with his stories nevermore. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to click my link in the description or scan my QR code to download Raid today and get insane bonuses only available via my link.